driving evasively, to get back to her temporary home. Then, of course, the reassembly of her safeguards before she could finally sleep. Email day was always a long one.
Hello there and welcome.
Though there was no connection between her present life and this email account, no repeat IP address, no discussion of places or names. As soon as she was done reading and, if the occasion called for it, answering her mail, she would be out the door and speeding out of town, putting as many miles between herself and this location as possible. Just in case.
Man, did you ever launch that?
Just in case had become Chris's unintentional mantra. She lived a life of over-preparation, but, as she often reminded herself, without that preparation, she wouldn't be living a life
or so
at
yards
all.
to the pin here, I'd say.
It would be nice not to have to take these risks, but the money wasn't going to last forever. Usually she would find a menial job at some mom-and-pop place, preferably one with handwritten records, but that kind of job generated only enough money for the basics, food and rent. Never the more expensive things in her life, like fake IDs, laboratory apparatus, and the various chemical components she hoarded. So, she maintained a light presence on the internet, found her rare paying client here and there, and did everything she could to keep this work from bringing her to the attention of those who wanted her to stop existing.
You're at 1 under.
The last 2 email days had been fruitless, so she was pleased to see a message waiting for her. Pleased for the approximately 0.2 of a second it took her to process the return address. l.karsten.463@dpt11a.net. Just out there, his real email address, easily traceable directly to her former employers. As the hair rose on the back of her neck and the adrenaline surged through her body, "Run! Run! Run!" it seemed to be shouting inside her veins. Part of her was still able to gape in disbelief at the arrogance. She always underestimated how astonishingly careless they could be. They can't be here yet, she reasoned with herself through the panic, her eyes already sweeping the library for men with shoulders too broad for their dark suits, for military haircuts, for anyone moving toward her position. She could see her car through the plate glass window, and it looked like no one had tampered with it, but she hadn't exactly been keeping watch, had she? So they'd found her again. But they had no way of knowing where she would decide to check her mail. She was religiously random about that choice. Just now, an alarm had gone off in a tidy gray office, or maybe several offices, maybe even with flashing red lights. Of course, there would be a priority command set up to trace this IP address. Bodies were about to be mobilized. But even if they used helicopters, and they had that capability, she had a few minutes, enough to see what Karsten wanted. The subject line was, "Tired of running?" Bastard. She clicked it open. The message wasn't long. "Policy has changed. We need you. Would an unofficial apology help? Can we meet? I wouldn't ask, but lives are on the line. Many, many lives." She'd always liked Karsten. He seemed more human than a lot of the other dark suits the department employed. Some of them, especially the ones in uniform, were downright scary. Which was probably a hypocritical thought, considering the line of work she used to be in. So of course it was Karsten they'd had make contact. They knew she was lonely and frightened, and they'd sent an old friend to make her feel all warm and fuzzy. Common sense, and she probably would have seen through the ploy without help, but it didn't hurt that the same ploy had been used once in a novel she'd stolen. She allowed herself 1 deep breath and 30 seconds of concentrated thought. The focus was supposed to be her next move.
That was nice.
Getting out of this library, this town, this state, as soon as possible, and whether that was enough.
All right, 2 unders, your adjusted
was
score.
Was her current identity still safe, or was it time to relocate again?
Okay, it's time to send this ball on its way. However, that focus was derailed by the insidious idea of Karsten's offer. What if this really was a way to get them to leave her alone? What if her certainty that this was a trap was born from paranoia and reading too much spy fiction? If the job was important enough, maybe they would give her back her life in exchange. Unlikely. Still,
There was no point in pretending that Karsten's email had gone astray. She replied the way she figured they were hoping she would, though she'd formed only the barest outline of a plan. Tired of a lot of things, Karsten. Where we first met, 1 week from today,
nice.
Noon. If I see anyone with you, I'm gone, yada yada yada. I'm sure you know the drill. Don't be stupid. She was on her feet and walking in the same moment, a rolling lope she'd perfected, despite her short legs, that looked a lot more casual than it was. She was counting off the seconds in her head, estimating how long it would take a helicopter to cover the distance between DC and this location. Of course, they could alert locals, but that wasn't usually their style. Not their usual style at all, and yet, she had an unfounded but still pressingly uncomfortable feeling that they might be getting tired of their usual style.
I don't know if this has enough.
It hadn't yielded the results they were looking for, and these were not patient people. They were used to getting what they wanted exactly when they wanted it, and they'd been wanting her dead for 3 years. This email was certainly a policy change, if it was a trap. She had to assume it was. That viewpoint, that way of framing her world, was the reason she was still breathing in and out. But there was a small part of her brain that had already begun to foolishly hope. It was a small-stakes game she was playing. She knew that. Just one life. Just her life.
Just want to save Par.
And this life she'd preserved against such overpowering odds was just that, and nothing more. Life. The very barest of the basics. One heart beating, one set of lungs expanding and contracting. She was alive, yes, and she had fought hard to stay that way. But during her darker nights, she'd sometimes wondered what exactly she was fighting for. Was the quality of life she maintained worth all this effort? Wouldn't it be relaxing to close her eyes and not have to open them again? Wasn't an empty black nothing slightly more palatable than the relentless terror and constant effort? Only one thing had kept her from answering yes,
let's tee up another
and taking
one.
one of the peaceful
4.
and painless exits readily available to her. And that was an overdeveloped competitive drive. It had served her well in medical school, and now it kept her breathing. She wasn't going to let them win. There was no way she would give them such an easy resolution to their problem. They would probably get her in the end, but they were going to have to work for it, damn them. And they would bleed for it too. She was in the car now, and 6 blocks from the closest freeway entrance. There was a dark ball cap over her short hair, wide-framed men's sunglasses covering most of her face,
like you're gonna
and a
hit
bulky
some
sweatshirt
sand here.
disguising her slender figure. To a casual observer, she would look a lot like a teenage boy. The people who wanted her dead had already lost some blood, and she found herself suddenly smiling as she drove, remembering. It was odd how comfortable she was with killing people these days, how satisfying she found it. She had become bloodthirsty, which was ironic, all things considered. She'd spent 6 years under their tutelage, and in all that time, they hadn't come close to breaking her down, to turning her into someone who enjoyed her work. But 3 years on the run from them had changed a lot of things. She knew she wouldn't enjoy killing an innocent person.
Adjusted score.
She was sure that corner had not been turned, nor would it be.
Okay, 5th hole coming up.
Some people in her line of work, her former line, were well and truly psychotic. But she liked to think that this was the reason her peers were not as good as she was. They had the wrong motivations. Hating what she did gave her the power to do it best. In the context of her current life, killing was about winning. Not the entire war, just one small battle at a time. But each was still a win. Someone else's heart would stop beating and hers would keep going. Someone would come for her, and instead of a victim, he would find a predator. A brown recluse spider, invisible behind her gossamer trap. This was what they had made her. She wondered if they took any pride at all in their accomplishment, or if there was only regret that they hadn't stomped on her fast enough. Once she was a few miles down the interstate, she felt better. Her car was a popular model, 1,000 identical vehicles on the highway with her now, and the stolen plates would be replaced as soon as she found a safe spot to stop. There was nothing to tie her to the town she'd just left. She'd passed 2 exits and taken a 3rd. If they wanted to blockade the freeway, they'd have no idea where to do it. She was still hidden, still safe.
On the green, well done.
Now.
This is for birdie.
Of course, driving straight home was out of the question at this point. She took 6 hours on the return, twisting around various highways and surface roads, constantly checking to be sure there was no one following. By the time she finally got back to her little rented house, the architectural equivalent of a jalopy, she was already half asleep. She thought about making coffee, weighing the benefits of the caffeine boost against the burden of one extra task, and decided to just muscle through it on the vapors of her energy supply. She dragged herself up the 2 rickety porch steps, automatically avoiding the rot-weakened spot on the left of the first tread, and unlocked the double deadbolts on the steel security door she'd installed her first week living here. The walls, just wooden studs, drywall, plywood, and vinyl siding, didn't provide the same level of security, but statistically, intruders went for the door first. The bars on the windows were not an insurmountable obstacle either, but they were enough to motivate the casual cat burglar to move on to an easier target. Before she twisted the handle, she rang the doorbell. 3 quick jabs that would look like one continuous push to anyone watching. The sound of the Westminster chimes was only slightly muffled by the thin walls. She stepped through the door quickly, holding her breath just in case. There was no quiet crunch of broken glass, so she exhaled as she shut the door behind her. The home security was all her own design. The professionals she'd studied in the beginning had their own methods. None of them had her specialized skill set. Neither did the authors of the various novels she used as implausible manuals now. Everything else she had needed to know had been easy to pull up on YouTube. A few parts from an old washing machine, a microcontroller board ordered online, a new doorbell, and a couple of miscellaneous acquisitions, and she had herself a solid booby trap. She locked the deadbolts behind her and hit the switch closest to the door to turn on the lights. It was set in a panel with 2 other switches. The middle was a dummy. The 3rd switch, the farthest from the door, was patched into the same low-voltage signal wire as the doorbell. Like that fixture and the door, the panel of switches was newer by decades than anything else in the small front room that was living area, dining room, and kitchen combined. Everything looked as she'd left it. Minimal, cheap furnishings. Nothing big enough for an adult to hide behind. Empty counters and tabletop, no ornaments or artwork. Sterile. She knew that even with the avocado and mustard vinyl flooring and the popcorn ceiling, it still looked a little like a laboratory. Maybe the smell was what made it feel like a lab. The room was so scrupulously sanitary, an intruder would probably attribute the pool supply store scent to cleaning chemicals. But only if he got inside without triggering her security system. If he triggered the system, he wouldn't have time to register many details about the room. The rest of the house was just a small bedroom and bathroom, set in a straight line from the front door to the far wall. Nothing in the way to trip her. She turned the light off, saving herself the walk back. She stumbled through the only door into her bedroom, sleepwalking through the routine. Enough light made it through the mini blinds, red neon from the gas station across the street, that she left the lamp off. First, she rearranged 2 of the long feather pillows on top of the double mattress that took up most of the space in the room into the vague shape of a human body. Then, the Ziploc bags full of Halloween costume blood were stuffed into the pillowcases. Close up, the blood wasn't very convincing, but the Ziplocs were for an attacker who broke the window, pushed the blinds aside, and shot from that vantage point.
Solid swing.
He wouldn't be able to detect the difference in the neon half-light. Next, the head. The mask she'd used was another after-Halloween sale acquisition, a parody of some political also-ran that had fairly realistic skin coloring. She'd stuffed it to roughly match the size of her own head,
looks like,
and sewn a cheap brunette wig into place.
To the pin here.
Most important, a tiny wire threaded up between the mattress and box spring, was hidden in the strands of nylon. A matching wire pierced through the pillow the head rested on. She yanked the sheet up, then the blanket, patted it all into shape, then twisted together the frayed ends of the two wires. It was a very tenuous joining. If she touched the head even lightly or jostled the pillow body a bit, the wires would slip silently apart. She stood back and gave the decoy a once-over through half-closed eyes. It wasn't her best work, but it did look like someone was asleep in the bed. Even if an intruder didn't believe it was Chris, he would still have to neutralize the sleeping body before he went on to search for her. Too tired to change into her pajamas, she just stepped out of her loose jeans. It was enough. She grabbed the fourth pillow and pulled her sleeping bag out from under the bed. They felt bulkier and heavier than usual. She dragged them into the compact bathroom, dumped them in the tub, and did the bare minimum of ablutions. No face washing tonight, just cleaning the teeth. The gun and the gas mask were both under the sink, hidden beneath a stack of towels. She pulled the mask over her head and tightened the straps, then clapped her palm over the filter port and inhaled through her nose to check the seal. The mask suctioned to her face just fine. It always did, but she never let familiarity or exhaustion make her skip the safety routine. She moved the gun into the wall-mounted soap dish with an easy reach above the bathtub.
Sweet.
She didn't love the gun. She was a decent shot compared with a totally untrained civilian, but not in the same class as a professional. She needed the option, though. Someday her enemies were going to figure her system out, and the people coming for her would be in gas masks too. Honestly, she was surprised her shtick had saved her this long. With an unopened chemical absorption canister tucked under her bra strap, she shuffled the 2 steps back into the bedroom. She knelt beside the floor vent on the right side of the bed she'd never used. The vent cover grill probably wasn't as dusty as it should be. The grill's top screws were only halfway in, and the bottom screws were missing altogether, but she was sure no one looking through the window would notice these details or understand what they meant if he did. Sherlock Holmes was about the only person she wasn't worried would make an attempt on her life. She loosened the top screws and removed the grill. A few things would be immediately obvious to anyone who looked inside the vent.
Nice.
1, the back of the vent was sealed off, so it was no longer functional. 2, the large white bucket and the big battery pack probably didn't belong down there. She pried the lid off the bucket and was immediately greeted by the same chemical smell that infused the front room, so familiar she barely noted it. She reached into the darkness behind the bucket and pulled out first a small, awkward contraption with a coil, metal arms, and thin wires, then a glass ampule about the size of her finger, and finally a rubber cleaning glove. She positioned the solenoid, the device she'd scavenged from a discarded washing machine, so that the arms extending from it were half submerged in the colorless liquid inside the bucket. She blinked hard twice, trying to force herself into alertness. This was the delicate part. She put the glove on her right hand, then pulled the canister free from her bra strap and held it ready in her left. With the gloved hand, she carefully inserted the ampule into the grooves she'd drilled into the metal arms for this purpose. The ampule rested just under the surface of the acid, the white powder inside it inert and harmless. However, if the current running through the wires that were attached so tenuously atop the bed were to be interrupted, the pulse would snap the solenoid shut, and the glass would shatter. The white powder would turn into a gas that was neither inert nor
and after
harmless.
That one, your adjusted score is coming in around 500.
It was essentially the same arrangement that she had in the front room. The wiring was just simpler here.
Let's let her rip.
This trap was set only while she slept. She replaced the glove and the vent cover, and then, with a feeling that was not quite buoyant enough to be called relief, lurched back to the bathroom. The door, like the vent, might have tipped off someone as detail-oriented as Mr. Holmes. The soft rubber liners around all the edges were definitely not standard. They wouldn't entirely seal the bathroom off from the bedroom, but they would give her more time. She half fell into the tub, a slow-motion collapse onto the puffy sleeping bag. It had taken her a while to get used to sleeping in the mask, but now she didn't even think about it as she gratefully closed her eyes.
Okay,
she shimmied
so
herself
right
into the down and nylon cocoon,
out.
squirming till the hard square of her iPad was nestled against the small of her back. It was plugged into an extension cord that got power from the front room wiring. If the power fluctuated along that line, the iPad would vibrate. She knew from experience that it was enough to wake her, even as tired as she was tonight. She also knew that she could have the canister, still in her left hand, hugged tight against her chest like a child's teddy bear, unsealed and screwed into place on the gas mask in less than 3 seconds, despite being half awake in the dark and holding her breath. She'd practiced so many times, and then she'd proved herself during the 3 emergencies that had not been practice. She'd survived. Her system worked. Exhausted as she was, she had to let her mind tick over the evils of her day before it would let her be unconscious. It felt horrible, like phantom limb pain, not connected to any actual piece of her body, just there, anyway, knowing they'd found her again. She wasn't satisfied with her email response either. She'd come up with the plan too impulsively to be sure of it, and it required her to act more quickly than she'd like. She knew the theory. Sometimes if you ran headlong at the guy holding the gun, you could catch him off guard. Flight was always her favorite move, but she didn't see a way out of the alternative this time. Maybe tomorrow, after her tired brain had rebooted. Surrounded by her web, she slept.
And after that one, your adjusted score is coming in around 5 under.
As she sat waiting for Karsten to show, she thought about the other times the department had tried to kill her. Barnaby, Dr. Joseph Barnaby, her mentor, the last friend she'd known, had prepared her for the first attempt. But even with all his foresight, planning, and deep-rooted paranoia, it was just dumb luck in the form of an extra cup of black coffee that had saved her life. She hadn't been sleeping well. She'd worked with Barnaby for 6 years at that point, and a little more than halfway through that time, he'd told her his suspicions. At first, she hadn't wanted to believe he could be right. They were only doing their job as directed, and doing it well. You can't think of this as a long-term situation, he'd insisted, though he'd been in the same division for 17 years. People like us, people who have to know things that no one wants us to know, eventually we become inconvenient. You don't have to do anything wrong. You can be perfectly trustworthy. They're the ones you can't trust. So much for working for the good guys. His suspicions had become more specific, then shifted into planning, which had evolved into physical preparation. Barnaby had been a big believer in preparation.
Nice swing.
Not that it had done him any good in the end. The stress had begun to escalate in those last months as the date for the exodus approached, and, unsurprisingly, she'd had trouble sleeping.
Here to the cup.
That particular April morning, it had taken 2 cups of coffee rather than the usual 1 to get her brain going. Add that extra cup to the smaller-than-average bladder in her smaller-than-average body, and you ended up with the doctor running to the can, too rushed to even log out, rather than sitting at her desk. And that's where she had been when the killing gas began filtering through the vents into the lab. Barnaby had been exactly where he was supposed to be. His screams had been his final gift to her, his last warning. They both had been sure that when the blow came, it wouldn't happen at the lab. Messy that way. Dead bodies usually raised a few eyebrows, and smart murderers tried to keep that kind of evidence as far removed from themselves as possible.
6 under after that.
They didn't strike when the victim was in their own living room. She should have known never to underestimate the arrogance of the people who wanted her dead.
Here.
They didn't worry about the law. They were too cozy with the people who made those laws. She also should have respected the power of pure stupidity to take a smart person completely by surprise. The next 3 times had been more straightforward. Professional contractors, she assumed, given that they'd each worked alone. Only men so far, though a woman was always a possibility in the future. One man had tried to shoot her, one to stab her,
you're in the sand,
and one to brain her with a crowbar.
Let's just get out of there.
None of these tries had been effective because the violence had happened to pillows, and then her assailants had died. The invisible but very caustic gas had silently flooded the small room. It took about 2.5 seconds once the connection between the wires was broken. After that, the assassin was left with a life expectancy of approximately 5 seconds, depending on his height and weight. It would not have been a pleasant 5 seconds. Her bathtub mixture was not the same thing they'd used for Barnaby, but it was close enough. It was the simplest way she knew to kill someone so swiftly and so painfully. And it was a renewable resource, unlike many of her weapons.
On the last one. Let's
All
see what
she
happens
needed
here.
was a good stock of peaches and a pool supply store. Nothing that required restricted access or even a mailing address. Nothing that her pursuers could track. It really pissed her off that they'd managed to find her again. She'd been furious since waking yesterday and had only gotten angrier as the hours passed while she made her preparations. She had forced herself to nap and then drove all the next night in a suitable car, rented using a very weak ID for one Taylor Golding and a recently obtained credit card in the same name. Early this morning, she'd arrived in the city she least wanted to be in, and that had turned her anger up to the next level. She'd returned the car to her Hertz near Ronald Reagan National Airport, then walked across the street to another company and rented a new one with District of Columbia plates. 6 months ago, she would have done things differently. Gathered her belongings from the small house she was renting, sold her current vehicle on Craigslist, purchased a new one for cash from some private citizen who didn't keep records, and then driven aimlessly for a few days until she found a medium-sized city town that looked right. There, she'd start the process of staying alive all over again. But now there was that stupid, twisted hope that Karsten was telling the truth. A very anemic hope. It probably wouldn't have been enough motivation on its own. There was something else, a small but irritating worry that she had neglected a responsibility. Barnaby had saved her life again and again. Every time she survived another assassination attempt, it was because he had warned her, had educated her, had made her ready. If Karsten was lying to her, which she was 97% sure he was, and arranging an ambush, then everything he'd said was a lie, including the part about her being needed. And if they didn't need her, that meant they'd found someone else to do the job, someone as good as she had been. They might have replaced her a long time ago, might have assassinated a whole line of employees for all she knew, but she doubted it. While the department had money and access, the one thing it had in short supply was personnel. It took time to locate, cultivate, and train an asset like Barnaby or herself. People with those kinds of skills didn't grow in test tubes. She'd had Barnaby to save her. Who was going to save the dumb kid they'd recruited after her? The newcomer would be brilliant, just as she had been. But he or she would be blind to the most important element. Forget serving your country. Forget saving innocent lives. Forget the state-of-the-art facilities and the groundbreaking science and the unlimited budget. Forget the 7-figure salary. How about not being murdered? No doubt the person now holding her old position had no idea that his or her survival was even in question. She wished she had a way to warn that individual, even if she couldn't spend all the time Barnaby had devoted to helping her.
Nice swing.
Even if it could be only one conversation. This is how they reward people like us. Get ready. But that wasn't an option.
And
the morning was spent on more preparations. She checked into the Braescott, a small boutique hotel under the name Casey Wilson. The ID she used wasn't much more convincing than Taylor Golding's, but 2 of the phone lines were ringing as she registered, and the busy desk clerk wasn't paying close attention. There were rooms available this early, the clerk told her, but Casey would have to pay for an extra day, as check-in did not begin till 3. Casey agreed to the stipulation without complaint. The clerk seemed relieved. She smiled at Casey, really looking at her for the first time.
9-footer here.
Casey controlled her flinch.
I think you can do this.
It didn't matter if this girl remembered Casey's face. Casey would make herself memorable enough in the next half hour. Casey used androgynous names on purpose. It was one of the strategies she'd gleaned from the case files Barnaby had fed her, something the real spies did. But it was also common sense, something the fiction writers had figured out as well. The logic was that if people were searching this hotel for a woman, they would start with the clearly female names in the register, like Jennifer and Kathy. It might take them another round to get to the Caseys and the Terrys and the Drews. Any time she could buy for herself was good. An extra minute
700
might
is where
save
we're
her
sitting
life.
after that hole. That's the adjusted
Casey
score.
shook her head at the eager bellman who stepped toward
15th
her,
hole
offering
coming
his
up.
services, and wheeled her single piece of luggage behind her to the elevator. She kept her face turned away from the camera over the control panel. Once inside the room, she opened the bag and removed a large briefcase and a zipper-top black tote. Other than these two things, her suitcase was empty. She took off the blazer that made her thin gray sweater and plain black pants look professional and hung it up. The sweater was pinned in the back to make it form-fitting. She removed the pins and let the sweater bag around her, changing her into someone a little smaller, maybe a bit younger. She removed her lipstick and rubbed off most
Solid
of her eye
swing.
makeup, then checked the effect in the large mirror over the dresser. Younger, vulnerable. The baggy sweater suggested that she was hiding in it. She thought it would do. If she'd been going to see a female hotel manager, she would have played it slightly differently. Perhaps tried to add some fake bruises with blue and black eyeshadow. But the name on the card at the desk downstairs was William Green, and she didn't think she would need to put in the extra time. It wasn't a perfect plan, and that bothered her. She would have liked to have another week just to review all the possible repercussions, but it was the best option she could set in motion with the time she'd had. It was probably overly elaborate, but it was too late to rethink it now. She called the desk and asked for Mr. Green. She was connected quickly.
This is William Green.
Now that was a swing.
How can I help you?
The voice was hearty and overly warm. She immediately had the mental image of a walrus of a man, bushy mustache included. Yes, I hope
Nice
I'm
little
not
approach
bothering you.
shot. Okay,
No,
11
of
footer
course
here.
not, Ms.
This is
Wilson.
definitely
I'm here to
makeable.
help in any way I can.
I do need help, but it might sound a little odd. It's, hard to explain.
Don't worry, miss. I'm sure I can be of assistance.
He sounded extremely confident. It made her wonder what kinds of odd requests he had fielded before. Oh dear, she dithered. This might be easier in person? She made it into a question.
Of course, Ms. Wilson. Fortunately, I will be available in 15 minutes.
Nice.
My office is on the first floor, just around the corner from the front desk. Will that suit?
All right,
Fluttery
9
and
under is your
relieved.
adjusted score
Yes,
after that hole.
thank you so much. She put the bags in the closet
Okay,
and
it's time to
carefully
send
counted
this
out the
ball on
bills
its
she
way.
needed from the stash in the large briefcase. She slipped this into her pockets, then waited 13 minutes. She took the stairs to avoid the elevator cameras. As Mr. Green ushered her into his windowless office, she was amused to see that her mental image had not been that far off. No mustache, no hair at all except for the barest hint of white eyebrows, but in all other ways
Someone's gonna
very
need to bite.
walrusy. It wasn't hard to play frightened, and halfway into her tale of her
Nice.
abusive ex-boyfriend
Okay, 20
who'd
feet
stolen the
to
family
the cup.
heirlooms, she knew she had him. He bristled in a very male way, looking as if he wanted to rant about the sort of monsters who hit little women. But he mostly held his peace aside from several "tut-tut, we'll take good care of you, you're safe here" kind of assurances. He probably would have helped her without the generous tip she gave him, but it certainly didn't hurt. He swore to tell only the members of the staff who were part of her plan, and she thanked him warmly. He wished her well and offered to bring the police in if that would help. Casey confessed with great sadness how ineffective the police and the restraining orders had been for her in the past. She implied that she could handle this alone as long as she had the help of a big, strong man like Mr. Green. He was flattered, and he hurried out to get everything ready. It wasn't the only time she'd
And after
played
that
this
hole, we're
card.
sitting at 10 under.
Barnaby
That's
had
her
suggested it
adjusted score.
initially, when their escape plan had reached the fine-tuning
Okay, let's
stage.
give it a nice
At first,
big
she had bristled at the
smash.
idea, offended in some obscure way, but Barnaby was always practical. She was small and female in a lot of people's heads. That would always make her the underdog. Why not use this assumption to her advantage? Play the victim to keep from being one. Casey went back to her room and changed into the clothes she'd kept inside the briefcase, trading her sweater for a tight black V-neck tee and adding a thick black belt with intricately braided leatherwork. Everything she took off had to fit back into the briefcase because she was leaving the suitcase and she wouldn't be returning to this hotel.
It looks like we have about 135 yards
she was
or so
already armed.
to go.
She never went out without taking some precautions. But now she moved to the high-alert version of her personal protection, arming herself to the literal teeth, or to the tooth, really. She inserted a fake crown full of something much less painful than cyanide, but just as deadly. It was the oldest trick in the book for a reason. It worked. And sometimes the last move you had was permanently extracting yourself from the hands of your enemies. The big black tote bag had 2 ornamental wooden pieces at the apex of the shoulder strap.
Okay,
inside the tote was her special jewelry in little padded boxes. Every piece was one of a kind and irreplaceable. She would never again have the access to acquire ornamental tools like these, so she was very careful with her treasures. 3 rings, 1 rose gold, 1 yellow gold, 1 silver. They all had small barbs hidden under clever little twisting hatches. The color of the metal indicated which substance coated the barb. Very straightforward, probably expected from her. Next, the earrings, which she always handled with delicate care. She wouldn't risk wearing them for this part of the journey. She would wait until she was closer to her target. Once they were in, she had to move her head very deliberately. They looked like simple glass globes, but the glass was so thin that a high note could shatter it, especially as the little spheres were already under pressure from the inside. If anyone grabbed her by the neck or head, the glass would burst with a quiet pop. She would hold her breath, which she could do for 1:15 easy, and close her eyes if possible. Her attacker would not know to do that. Around her neck went a largish silver locket. It was very conspicuous and would command the attention of anyone who knew who she truly was. There was nothing deadly about it, though. It was just a distraction from the real dangers. Inside was a photo of a pretty little girl with fluffy, straw-colored hair. The child's full name was handwritten on the back of the picture. It looked like something a mother or an aunt would wear. However, this particular girl was Karsten's only grandchild. Hopefully, if it was too late for Casey, the person who found her body would be a real cop who, due to the lack of identification, would be forced to dig into this evidence and bring her murder around to the doorstep where it ultimately belonged. It probably wouldn't really hurt Karsten, but it might make things inconvenient for him, might make him feel threatened or worry that she'd released other information elsewhere.
Pin, I'd say.
Because she knew enough about hidden disasters and classified horrors to do much more than inconvenience Karsten. But even now, 3 years past her first death sentence, she hadn't grown comfortable with the idea of treason or the very real possibility of causing a panic. There was no way to foresee the potential damage of her revelations, the harm they might cause to innocent citizens. So she'd settled for just making Karsten think that she had done something so reckless. Maybe the worry would give him an aneurysm. A pretty little locket filled with drippings of revenge to make losing the game more palatable.
For the bird.
The cord the locket was attached to, however, was deadly. It had the tensile strength of airline cable in proportion to its size and was easily strong enough to garrote a person. The cord closed with a magnet rather than a clasp. She had no desire to be lassoed with her own weapon. The wooden embellishments on her tote's shoulder strap had slots where the ends of the cords fit. Once the cord was in place, the wooden pieces became handles. Physical force wasn't her first choice, but it would be unexpected. It gave her an advantage to be ready. Inside the intricate patterns of her black leather belt were hidden several spring-loaded syringes. She could pull them individually or flip a mechanism that would expose all the sharp ends at once if an attacker